This video will cover subtopic 5.2, Natural Selection. Here are a list of understandings, applications, and skills that we will cover in this video. Before we start talking about natural selection, it is important to talk about Charles Darwin and how he came to his ideas for natural selection. So Charles Darwin was born in England in 1809. His father was a physician and convinced Darwin to train to become a physician himself, but eventually he quit due to a lack of interest. After leaving medical school, he enrolled in Cambridge University and studied under the botanist John Henslow. After graduation, Darwin was recommended to Captain Robert Fitzroy, who himself was an accomplished scientist, who was preparing the survey ship, the HMS Beagle, for a long voyage around the world. So Darwin accompanied Captain Robert Fitzroy on this voyage. Now, the primary mission of the voyage was to chart the poorly known stretches of the South American coastline at the time. The HMS Beagle left England in December of 1831 and spent 5 years traveling around the world, returning in 1836. During his trip, Darwin studied and observed the plants and animals in the temperate regions of South America. So the HMS Beagle, when it left England, it stopped in Africa and then spent a lot of time traveling down the coastline of South America. And at these stops, it is here that Darwin collected a number of samples of plants and animals from this region of South America, collected fossils, and studied the geology of these different areas. Now, one of the stops of the HMS Beagle was that of the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a group of volcanic islands which are located near the equator west of South America, and it's just off the coast of Ecuador. So here Darwin collected a number of samples that inspired his ideas. So Darwin collected many specimens at the Galapagos Islands, including finches, which are now known as Darwin's finches, and mockingbirds. Darwin noticed that these birds, though similar to each other, seemed to be different species. Some were unique to individual islands, while others lived on two or more adjacent islands. Darwin noted that although the Galapagos species resembled living species on the South American mainland, they were not known anywhere else in the world. Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos Islands had been colonized by organisms that had strayed from South America and then diversified, giving rise to new species on these various islands. During his voyage, Darwin observed many examples of adaptations. And when we say adaptations, we mean inherited characteristics of organisms that enhance their survival and reproduction in specific environments. As Darwin reassessed his observations, he began to perceive adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as closely related processes. So after returning from this voyage around the world, Darwin spent many years developing his hypothesis of natural selection, about 20 years or so, which was rooted, his work that he was developing was rooted in the work of many other individuals. So in this diagram here, it just shows a timeline for when Darwin was doing his work and when he lived, and the work that his work was based on as well. So, his work was closely based on work by a scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who actually came up with the theory of evolution and proposed ways in which evolution happened. Darwin also based his work on that of Malthus, who did population studies, and that of Charles Lyell, who did a lot of work with geology. So Darwin took a lot of these ideas and really spent a lot of time developing his own ideas and carefully crafting his observations to develop his ideas of natural selection. Now, in 1858, a British naturalist by the name of Alfred Wallace, who was working in the East Indies, sent Darwin a manuscript with a similar hypothesis of natural selection, so a hypothesis very similar to what Darwin was developing. Now, Charles Lyell, who was a good friend of Darwin, convinced Darwin to hurry up and finish his work, convinced Wallace to hold off publishing his work, and Lyell presented both works to the Linnean Society of London, which is basically like the Royal Science Society. Wallace admired Darwin's work and the careful crafting that he spent on this, and agreed to let him be known as the main architect of natural selection. Darwin published his work on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. In Darwin's book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, he made several arguments for how natural selection occurs, and the main crux of these arguments are that there is heritable variation within species, that better adapted individuals have a competitive advantage, populations are generally stable despite large numbers of offspring, and advantageous heritable traits become more frequent over generations. So we'll have a look at each of these main arguments and how it creates this basis for natural selection. Before we do that, though, we'll talk about what is natural selection. So natural selection is a process in which individuals with certain inherited traits leave more offspring than individuals with other traits. So ultimately, natural selection depends on variation within populations. And typical populations will vary in many different respects. So, for example, if you have a look at humans, there are many different characteristics and traits within human populations that vary. The example provided here is that of the ladybug or the harlequin ladybird, which can be highly variable in appearance. So the variation that's shown in these pictures here is based on the shell color. So you can have a red shell, orange shell, black shell. It can be based on the presence of spots. So you can have a small number of spots, lots of spots, no spots. The coloration of the spots, so there can be orange spots, red spots, black spots, and even the size of the spots, from small spots to kind of medium-sized spots to rather large spots. So there can be lots of variation within these species. And the implication of variation is that some individuals will be more suited to particular conditions and hence more likely to survive. It is important to note that although natural selection occurs through interactions between individual organisms and their environment, individuals do not evolve. It is the population that evolves over time. What natural selection does is that it can amplify or diminish only these heritable traits. So we'll get into variation and how does variation happen within a population. So given the fact that there is variation between members of a species, this variation can be the result of new alleles being produced or new allele combinations. New alleles, which remember are gene variants, and those genes are what control these traits that get expressed. So new alleles can be produced through the process of random mutation, which can occur when DNA replicates. So that DNA polymerase, which does have that proofreading mechanism to it, isn't always perfect. It does make the occasional mistake. So you can get changes to the DNA sequence when DNA replicates. And random mutations can come about through other means, which include things like UV radiation or exposure to other chemicals or different types of chemicals. So if these new alleles that are produced happen in germline cells, such as sperm cells or egg cells, this can be then passed on to offspring. And variation can happen through new allele combinations, which can happen through sexual reproduction. Remember that asexual reproduction results in a clone of that individual, whereas sexual reproduction brings together the alleles of two individuals. And so these new allele combinations can come about through that process of meiosis, where you get crossing over, which happens during prophase 1, or the random assortment of chromosomes, how those chromosomes line up during metaphase 1. Now, ultimately, with sexual reproduction, there can be random fertilization that occurs, and that random fertilization will result in the combination of alleles from two individuals. So it will allow mutations to be brought together and allow different allele combinations to be combined. So in variation through meiosis, this can result in the genetic variation, as there's almost infinite combinations or infinite variation in the gametes as a result of that process of meiosis. So recall that during meiosis, there is crossing over that can happen between homologous chromosomes, which can produce new combinations of alleles. And there is the random assortment of chromosomes in metaphase 1. So how those chromosomes line up, or how those homologous chromosomes line up, can give rise to a huge number of combination of maternal and paternal chromosomes. The larger the number of chromosomes, the greater the variety of gametes that can be produced. So in sexual reproduction, any one of those gametes can randomly fertilize any one of the gametes from the other individual. Non-fatal gene and chromosome mutations can create new alleles and thus new elements of diversity. Now, variation can also come about through mutation, so just recall that a gene mutation involves a change in the sequence of the base in the bases of a particular gene. So as I mentioned, this can occur during DNA replication by DNA polymerase, and can also be caused by ionizing radiation, for example, UV light, and chemicals such as benzene. This can give rise to new alleles. Now, as I said, if the mutation occurs in the ovaries or testes, the new alleles can be passed to offspring. So these are considered germline mutations. So with these variations now, you can have better adapted individuals that can have a competitive advantage. So variations that give an advantage are selected for. Basically, variations that allow individuals to best compete for resources will allow those individuals to survive long enough to reproduce and pass on these particular traits. Variations that give a disadvantage are selected against. So a variation or trait that means an individual is less well suited to the environment will make it more difficult for that individual to survive. The individual is less likely to pass on the traits. So if they're not going to be able to reproduce, they're not going to be able to pass on that trait or that variation or that allele. And so that allele will decrease in frequency within a population. Now, according to evolutionary theory, adaptations develop by natural selection, not with the direct purpose of making an individual suited to its environment. So it just happens the variation gives those individuals an advantage. And so the variations do not arise to help the individual adapt to their environment. So basically what this looks like is these diagrams basically show the two theories at the time. So this is evolution as proposed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And then here we have Darwin's natural selection. So according to Lamarck, and we'll use the example of giraffes, So giraffes acquired their long necks, as at one time giraffes had short necks, and in order to reach the leaves in the trees, or those leaves higher up, they had to stretch their necks, and that stretching of their necks made their necks a bit longer to be able to reach those higher leaves. And those giraffes, as they stretched their necks, were able to pass those longer necks on to their offspring, and those offspring stretched their necks a little bit more, creating a bit longer of a neck, and then they pass that on to the next generation, where we have the giraffes that we have today. That are able to reach those leaves high up in the tree. So Lamarck suggested, that it was this stretching of a neck that would give rise to these populations of giraffes with long necks. Now, you can essentially think about this another way. You can think about somebody who lifts weights and becomes very muscular. If they have a child, that child is not born very muscular, or it doesn't guarantee that that child will be muscular at all when they get older. So, traits aren't kind of passed on like that. That's kind of becoming muscular is like an acquired trait that doesn't necessarily pass on to offspring, or doesn't pass on to offspring. How Darwin's natural selection differs from Lamarck is that here we have our population of giraffes, and within this population there is variation that exists. So you have some individuals with slightly longer necks, some individuals with slightly shorter necks. The individuals with the longer necks, can better reach these leaves, and are, able to compete for food more effectively than those with the short necks. So the short-necked giraffe can't necessarily reach those leaves very effectively, and the short-necked giraffe is less likely to survive. You can see the giraffe lying on the ground. It's less likely to survive and pass on its genes or its traits to the next generation. So these giraffes here with the longer necks are better suited to this particular environment for reaching these leaves, and can pass on these traits to their offspring. And over time, the entire population of giraffes will have longer necks, or long necks. Now, one of Darwin's arguments was that populations are generally stable despite large numbers of offspring, and this was based on the work of Malthus. So, organisms can vary in the number of offspring that they produce. There's a low number of offspring, such as the ground hornbill, which will produce one offspring every 3 years. You have fungal species, which produce high numbers of offspring. So, this particular species of fungus can produce as many as 7 trillion spores at one time. Whether it's low numbers or high numbers, basically what ends up happening is that more offspring are produced than the environment can support for that particular species. And because more offspring are produced than what the environment can support, this leads to what's called the struggle for survival. And the struggle for survival takes many forms, where these different individuals will compete for space, they will compete for mates. They have to deal with infections, such as parasites. They have to deal with predation, and also compete for food. And so these individuals that are better suited, or better adapted to handle the struggles for survival, are more likely to live and reach reproductive age and pass on those traits by reproducing. So the example of this is, this particular fish population here. So, a male and female fish can produce hundreds of fertilized eggs. So they will produce way more eggs than a population could handle, or the environment could handle, should all those eggs hatch. Now, the idea here is not all those eggs will hatch. A lot will be destroyed, carried away, will get eaten, or might not be viable. So several or a small number of those eggs will hatch into juvenile fish, which is still a larger number than what the environment can support. And, just through predation, competition for space, that struggle for survival, only a very small number of fish will reach adulthood. And so even though there's a high number of offspring that have been produced, very few make it to adulthood, and it's these individuals that are best adapted to that environment are the ones that are going to make it to adulthood and are going to be the ones to reproduce. And so these populations end up being stable over time. So another one of Darwin's arguments was that advantageous heritable traits become more frequent over generations. So those traits that give an advantage that are heritable become more frequent. So if we look at the fact that we have variation within these populations, and these variations can be inherited. So we have our population that has a lot of variation within it. Remember that populations will produce more offspring than the environment can support. And, over time, there can be changes to the environment, or, there can be dry seasons and wet seasons. But ultimately, this leads to the struggle for survival, which is basically these selection pressures. A struggle for survival is basically going to act on these different variations. And so advantageous variations will be selected for, will survive. Those individuals that can compete best for those varying resources are the ones that are going to survive. They are the ones that are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes. And so this can cause the allele frequency to change over time. As with the fact that variations that do not provide an advantage, those individuals will be selected against. So they will die, or they are less likely to reproduce. And because they're less likely to reproduce, they're less likely to pass on their genes. And so these genes that are disadvantageous within a particular environment, the frequency of those genes will decrease over time. And so those alleles that provide an advantage basically become the predominant alleles within a population, and this allows the population to evolve to be adapted or better adapted to the environment. And so this whole process here is that process of natural selection that will allow advantageous heritable traits to become more frequent over generations. And so individuals that reproduce are the ones that pass on characteristics to their offspring. So those variations that provide an advantage, those individuals, like I said, are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes. So most variation between individuals can be passed on to offspring, so for example skin color, and acquired characteristics are things that are not passed on. So an acquired characteristic, for example, would be an elephant with a broken tusk. So if an elephant breaks a tusk while they're alive, if they have offspring afterwards, those elephants will not have calves with broken tusks. So those calves will not inherit a broken tusk. They'll have whole and complete tusks as they grow older. So that is considered an acquired characteristic. It is something that is not passed on. So natural selection can lead to change within a species. And so as those allele frequencies change, this will allow populations to evolve to be better adapted to their environment. So better adapted individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce, and this will lead to an increase in the proportion of individuals in a population with characteristics that make them well adapted to that environment. So some examples of natural selection at play that we can see and have been studied is that of antibiotic resistance. And antibiotic resistance is an example of natural selection. So with the discovery of antibiotics, which are used to treat bacterial infections, this revolutionized medicine. Um, Antibiotics were thought to be a permanent answer to controlling bacterial diseases. However, we know this is not necessarily the case. Antibiotic resistance is now a common problem. In 1962, the Surgeon General of the U.S., Dr. William Stewart, was provided this very famous quote that it is time to close the book on infectious disease and declare the war against pestilence won. Basically, he was saying that with antibiotics, we can send bacterial diseases into the dustbin of history. But we spoke a little bit. He spoke a little bit too soon. We have a whole host of problems now with antibiotic resistance. So after an antibiotic is introduced and used, bacterial resistance will quickly appear. Resistance to the antibiotic can spread to different species of bacteria through conjugation. And in species, the proportion of infections that are caused by a resistant strain will increase. The development of antibiotic resistance is an example of evolution by natural selection. So the example of this is that of MRSA, or in this what they refer to in this diagram as multiple resistant Staphylococcus aureus, what is typically referred to as methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. But anyway, Staphylococcus aureus can be a human pathogen if it gets in the wrong place. Staphylococcus aureus is normally found on your skin, so it is a commensal bacteria. But like I said, if it gets into the wrong place, it can become pathogenic. And so when it gets in the wrong place and becomes pathogenic, it's an infection that's easily treated or used to be easily treated with an antibiotic such as penicillin. So penicillin will wipe out the population of bacteria, but there could be one bacteria or few bacteria that could carry a gene for resistance to that antibiotic. So they're basically they're able to inactivate that antibiotic. That susceptible population gets wiped out, and this gives rise to a new population of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And so over time, this species of bacteria can become more prominent out in the environment and within the human population. And then there can also be species or individuals within this population that could be resistant to a different type of antibiotic. And so when this population causes disease in an individual, a different antibiotic gets used because these bacteria are not going to be susceptible to penicillin, so they might try penicillin at first and find that penicillin is not having an effect on the disease. So then they'll treat with another antibiotic which will wipe out that susceptible population to the antibiotic, but you might have a few individuals that are resistant to both forms of antibiotics and now become the predominant individuals within this population. And this gives rise to bacterial species, or in this case, Staphylococcus bacteria, that are resistant to multiple forms of antibiotics. And this chart here just shows that over the years, you can basically track the percentage of the development of multiple resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains. Now, another example of natural selection is that of Darwin's finches. So, in the Galapagos Islands, as I mentioned, which are located off the coast of Ecuador, there is a small island called Daphne Major, which is located north of this particular island called Santa Cruz. Now, all of these islands are inhabited by various species of finches, which are now known as Darwin's finches. But on Daphne Major, beak shape and beak size of Darwin's finches has been studied very extensively on this particular island. And what has been found is that under certain environmental conditions, scientists have been able to track changes in beak size of a particular species of finch, referred to as the medium ground finch. So, with beak depth or beak size, as it's called here in the chart, this is correlated with body size and the ability to crack larger seeds. So basically, the bigger the beak, the better the ability to break open larger seeds and be able to feed. Now, during drought conditions, plants will produce fewer, harder seeds, and during wet years, they will produce softer seeds. Now, what this chart shows here is that over a number of years, when there were dry years and thus only harder seeds available, the individuals with larger beak sizes were able to crack those seeds open and able to feed, and thus were the ones that survived and passed on their genes and for larger beak size. And what scientists found was that there was an increase in larger beak size. And every time there was a dry year that would happen, they could see that there was a very quick increase in beak size within those populations. So this is the end of the video for 5.2, natural selection.